"She wants to talk," Leo said the next day. He gauged Luca's expression, but Luca made sure not to show any emotion. He lowered the cup of coffee he had lifted to his mouth, placing it on his kitchen counter. Even after making it home, peace didn't greet him for the whole night, leaving him restless. He refused to dwell on why. He also refused to talk about the woman who made him so inexplicably angry. "So what?" "So what?" Leo gave him an incredulous look. "They've been held hostage for hours. We got what we needed. The heirloom of the daughter of Spain is safely in Enzo Romano's hands. We did our part." Leo made sense, but Luca couldn't help but sense something else in his tone. He scanned Leo's stony face, his tight jaw, taking note of how his throat bobbed and how his sharp eyes weren't focused on him, but on the wall behind him. Luca's eyes narrowed instinctively. "Don't tell me you—" "All I'm saying is we have no need for them anymore. I say we should let them go," he hurriedly elaborated as if covering himself. "Then let them go, Leo." Luca waved him off. Turning his back on him, he aggressively dumped his coffee down his drain, throwing the mug into his sink. It broke with the force. "You and Danny brought them there, not me." "That doesn't exactly sound like a thank you," he fumed. Luca whirled on him. "Of course it's not. You could have left them and retrieved the heirloom. As you said, we have no need for them. They clearly won't give many answers, so what good are they?" He wanted to add that their decision had caused him 2 more bruises on his face and a cut on his cheekbone, but he held his tongue. Leo's glare didn't cease. "Right, my mistake, and my fault for getting back the heirloom when they would have been long gone by the time you even formed a plan, leader." He spat the title. "I wonder how Enzo would have reacted then." Luca grew silent at the piercing words, but deep down knew Leo was right. Leo fisted his hands and shoved them into his sweatpants pockets, moving toward the door. Before he could leave, Luca muttered, "You're right." Leo paused but didn't look at him. He released a deep breath through his nose and opened the door. "I'll make sure they're gone by tomorrow." And he was gone. Luca was left to face the deeper truth of Leo's words. He was right after all. Leo was a better strategist, a better fighter, and even a better leader than he was. Leo, being 1 year older than Luca, wasn't a reasonable excuse. Enzo Romano was Luca's father, the esteemed leader of Ladri de Ladri, and Luca had big shoes to fill at the age of only 17 years old. But it had been 10 years since then, almost 11, and he still fell short. Enzo would take Leo as a son over Luca any day, and it was a truth no one cared to hide. Leo was favored when he was taken in at 3 years old and trained as one of Enzo's own. He grew up to be everything he was trained to be and more, and the only reason he wasn't sitting by Enzo's side was because Luca was his heir. Sometimes Luca considered letting him have the title of leader and live the life he'd always wanted to live. A life that the one true living God would be proud of. But it was too ridiculous, too good to be true. This was the only life Luca was destined to have, and he'd have to get used to that. Another week passed, and Luca had finally decided to visit Leo and Danny. Since the acquisition of the most sought-after heirloom, Enzo Romano had been quiet, giving Luca time to gather his thoughts. He entered the house unannounced and faltered at the sound of light conversation. He recognized Leo's voice, but not the soft, feminine one. He turned the corner, peered into the room, and froze. Leo was talking with the captives, who weren't tied up but looked overly comfortable. The women wore new clothes as if they'd been given a chance to freshen up. Luca's jaw clenched. "What is this?" All heads turned in his direction, including Danny, who he hadn't noticed skulking in the corner of the room. What was with the expression on his usually dopey face? The women stepped back as he came further into the room, demanding an answer. It seemed to be the only thing he inherited from his dad aside from his appearance. To his surprise, the she-devil took a defiant step toward him, meeting his glare head-on. "I've been meaning to speak to you." Luca laughed darkly, looking past her at Leo. "You said they'd be gone last week. What's the matter? Did they grow on you or something?" His smoky eyes narrowed on him, and he crossed tattooed arms over his broad chest. He nodded toward her. I think you should hear her out, Luca. Luca glared at Leo for using his name, challenging him as he straightened. Should I? Leo didn't back down, only keeping a firm expression. You should. He looked back at the woman who hadn't taken her eyes off him. She crossed her arms, forcing his eyes to focus on the raw skin encircling her wrists. A sharp pang hit him right in the chest at his rather harsh method of keeping her from escaping the day before, but he pushed it aside. He leaned closer to her, bending down so that their faces were even. Her eyes blazed in a challenge and he accepted it. He straightened to his full height. Fine, I'll hear you out, but first, tell me your names. Brooklyn Flores, a voice said from a further distance away. Thief number 1 didn't seem fazed in the slightest at mentioning the name she so secretly kept just a week before. Luca only offered a simple nod to show her he acknowledged, and fixed expectant eyes on the other woman he'd been wondering the name of from the moment she left him unconscious on the rooftop. She only stared at him, her jaw feathering under the hard clench of her teeth. She seemed to be fighting within herself whether to satisfy his curiosity or not. Finally, she reluctantly said, Aya Rivera. Such a pretty name for a hell-driven beast such as yourself, he sarcastically thought. Satisfied with their answers, he pulled out a chair and carelessly sat, letting his eyes drift between the intruders. They wasted no time in getting to the point. We want to work together. Luca's eyebrows raised in intrigue. Aya squared her shoulders. But on one condition, you give us back the heirloom you stole from us. You stole it first, he retorted. Aya opened her mouth with a sharp reply, but Brooklyn elbowed her and shook her head. Luca watched the interaction with interest. He sat back, resting his head on his arms, but humored her. And why would I do that? Aya growled, but with a warning glare from her partner, she sighed. Because we can get you something more valuable. Ophelia's rose. Luca's cocky expression dropped, and he sat forward, his dark eyebrows lowering. That's a myth, a made-up artifact only fools try to find. She clicked her tongue, knowing she had his attention more than before. It's not a myth, and we know where it's located. Rannoch Museum. It's in a small city. Not many know of it, but that's where Ophelia's rose is. We could acquire it in a mere week, and you can be even richer than you are now. He sat back again. And why should I believe you? His skepticism did nothing to sway her proposal. She only shrugged. I could be lying, but if I'm not, you could be missing out on the chance of a lifetime. That artifact is the most sought-after item by any thief. You could be the one to have it in your grasp. He hated to admit it, but this could be the offer of a lifetime. As he considered it, he caught Danny's eyes, a dark and distrusting look on his face. He slowly shook his head in warning, and a big part of Luca applauded his unwillingness to trust these women. The other half, however, wanted to hear them out. He stood from his chair, running a hand through his hair. Give us a moment. The women left without another word, closing the door behind them. Luca looked between Danny and Leo, settling his eyes on Leo first. You trust them? I believe they're telling the truth. For what reason, I don't know. Leo was never unsure of anything. This set Luca on edge. He looked at Danny, finding a scowl on his face. What about you? Of course I don't. He was unabashedly loud, not seeming to care that they might hear him. These random chicks come out of nowhere, claiming they work for no one, but one of them seems too eager to help, and the other is a mishmash of emotions. He crossed his arms and looked to the side. I say they're screwing us over. Luca nodded at Danny. I agree with Danny, Leo. We can't trust them. But a part of him questioned his authority. Never had he worked with an enemy, and he wasn't planning to start now. But what if they were telling the truth? That question made him say, I say we interrogate them more. Let them believe we trust them until we can get enough information to see if they're crossing us. If not, we'll proceed. His response received mixed reactions. Danny appeared outraged, and Leo looked surprised. Both replied, What? Luca turned away from them. You heard me. Let's feel them out and see if they're legit. If not, we trash them. Leo seemed to have no further objections, but Danny scoffed. Luca decided he'd have a little talk with Danny later, knowing he would eventually hear him out. If he were like Enzo Romano, he'd rough Danny up and instill his authority in a rage, but Luca wasn't like his father. At least not yet. Luca opened the door and found Aya and Brooklyn with their backs facing him. He cleared his throat before saying, "We're in." The women exchanged looks, ones he couldn't decipher, and nodded at him. Aya stepped closer, demanding his full attention as she stuck her hand out. "Then we have a deal?" Luca took her outstretched hand in a firm shake. "We have a deal. Only if you're not crossing us," he added in his mind, trying his best to ignore the odd sensation he got at the feeling of her soft, deep-toned hand in his. Things were going as planned. Luca allowed his new enemy partners to believe they were gaining his trust while gauging their behavior. He sneakily had Leo run a background check on them through the connections they had and was eagerly awaiting what they found. The first week consisted of allowing Aya and Brooklyn to map out how they'd successfully acquire the chimeric artifact, Ophelia's Rose. They sprawled out a map on the large planning table, marking the exact city in which the artifact was allegedly located. They then sketched out the interior of Rannoch Museum, the exhibit where Ophelia's Rose should be kept. They discussed how they'd infiltrate the building without triggering the alarms, and how they'd escape if, somehow, they were unable to get away without a sound. Luca had to confess the plan was well thought out, so strategically planned, he nearly believed the little hoax they put together.
Any objections? He returned to reality just as everyone's eyes centered on him.
"I'm sorry, I wasn't listening." He held back a smirk as Aya gritted her teeth from her leaned position over his table, her eyes burning with irritation. "I said, you'll be coming with me. Brooke and Leo will be back up if all goes downhill, and Danny will serve as our eyes in the sky." He was listening then, and he didn't like the first part. "Wait, why do I have to go with you? Why can't one of these two go?" He gestured to Brooklyn and Leo. "Because you're the most stealthy," Leo concluded as if it were simple, his expression more than placid. Luca glared at him, wondering why he had no objections to working beside Brooklyn. He released a reluctant sigh, rolling his eyes. "Whatever."
The next week arrived, and by Brooklyn's request, they worked on combat for their upcoming heist, claiming they could never be too prepared. Leo briskly agreed, receiving an incredulous look from both Luca and Danny. He pretended not to see them as he faced Brooklyn in the renovated room they used for working out and sparring. The dark, glossy floors stretched out, giving them more than enough space to spread out. When Aya approached Luca, he watched her skeptically. "You're going to be my partner." "What?" Luca's chest burned as he caught Leo's eye, watching him innocently shrug and instruct Brooklyn on how to do a certain combat move. She looked more than willing to let him touch her waist and maneuver her to the right position. Luca growled. When he turned to Aya, his mouth dried as she removed her jacket, a well-fitting tank top hugging her torso. He met her keen hazel eyes, noticing she was overly ready to spar with him. The challenge in her stature ignited a fire in him that he hadn't felt before. He was starting to believe there was even more to this woman than she let on. He readied himself, dropping into a fighting stance. They began circling each other, assessing their opponent, and preparing themselves for any notion that the other was going to strike. Luca let his eyes trail the shockingly defined muscles in her arms, lingering on a dark raven tattoo etched onto her smooth right shoulder. Before he could observe it further, she lunged at him, catching him off guard. He happened to sidestep her at the last moment, but she regained her footing, swiveling around and sending a jab to his ribs. He blocked it with a large hand, sending his own punch toward her arm. Just a tap for training purposes. She broke away from him, bouncing on the balls of her feet. He sensed she was about to strike again and took the initiative. Instead of lunging as she had, he swept his leg out, catching her legs in one fell swoop, and sent her falling onto her back. Her breath audibly left her lungs, and he was on her, giving her no time to anticipate his move.
As he was now starting to realize, he kept finding himself locking her arms to her side in a move he'd been taught by one of his father's men when he was 16 years old. It worked as a tactic to temporarily immobilize your opponent, but it only lasted for so long. You needed to move quickly, either knocking them out or taking a more gruesome road to prevent further injuries from being so close to a threat. He stared down at Aya and was met with a murderous gaze. Her face went rigid with poorly suppressed fury, and Luca wasn't sure if he shuddered out of delight or fear. For his safety, he released her and stood. He wasn't sure what possessed him as he sent her a cocky grin, boasting of his rather easy victory. "We have to stop ending things like this. It makes me fear you're not ready for our heist." Although his remark was meant to mock, it held some truth. He was glad it was only he who'd restrained her. But what if someone else got hold of her and he wasn't able to save her?
Not that he cared to save her in the first place. She was a spitfire, and he wanted nothing to do with someone so reserved yet dangerous. Especially not if he had to depend on her to retrieve an important artifact. If it was real.
Something crashed into his chest, sending him to the ground. His back barely hit the floor before a fist flew into his cheek with a force so strong that his head whipped to the side. A familiar metallic tang filled his mouth from where his cheek was cut by his tooth. Aya swung again, but this time he caught her fist. Squeezing it, he glared up at her. "We're sparring, remember?" Instead of answering, she tried to punch him with her other fist, but he caught that as well. She struggled against his grip, trying to pull her hands free, but he yanked her closer. Close enough for their breaths to fan each other's faces. "That doesn't look like sparring to me," Leo commented from beside them. They turned their heads to see Leo and Brooklyn staring down at them with an odd look in their eyes.
Luca pushed her off him, barely processing the way she landed on her backside with a surprised gasp. He pushed past Leo and stormed out of the room, his blood boiling.
They couldn't find much, at least not any dirt. Luca glanced up at Leo with a frown. "What's that supposed to mean?" Leo massaged his neck and then sighed. "It means we might be able to trust them. Your words, remember?" Luca abandoned his phone, running a hand through his hair with a sigh of his own. Right, they were. "What, so we're actually working with them?" Danny questioned from in front of his computer. He looked repulsed. "Relax, Danny. It's not permanent or anything," Luca reassured him. "Plus, we'll have more money than what we originally started with. You can't say no to that." Danny gradually stood, but Enzo wouldn't agree to give up the heirloom. "He's been pining after it for years, Luca. You're not using your head." Luca found himself standing as well, and he advanced toward Danny, watching him take a cautious step back the closer he got. Luca got in his face with a glare. "I know what I'm doing, Danny, and you're either in or out. Do you work for my dad, or do you work for me?" A look flashed in Danny's eyes, a glint too quick for Luca to catch. Danny's expression darkened, but he said, "You. I work for you." "Then trust me. We'll get the artifact, and Enzo will be thanking us. He's never declined money, and I doubt he will now."